Here is a purple ink by Robert Oster Pygmy Purple. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink. The paper I'm using here is a Maruman Mnemosyne Notebook. This certainly is much more of a purple than Hippo Purple was, though it is a bit of a magenta link. I'm okay with it. I really do like the color that I'm getting, and I still do see quite a bit of it as a purple more than a magenta. With the right conditions, it does shade, and when it does a very good job. Certainly, you're going to get some tone variation depending on the pen, which means you have some options for the color itself. I do enjoy using this ink, and not just for the color, but for what the ink represents in the whole of the fountain pen community. This has really got a great cause. Now, there were some issues with the Kickstarters, and I hope that that would not stop people from backing it in the future, in any of their futures, because I do think that the products that they're putting out with this are very nice, and certainly worth the wait. The pen for today is a Jinhao 51A. All of the writing samples are done with a Platinum 3776 with a soft fine nib which writes rather dry, a Hero 7035 with a fine nib that writes wet, a Visconti Van Gogh with a medium nib and an average flow, a Lamy Safari with a broad nib that writes average. Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there, starting with the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Looking at the soft fine, it does look a bit more like a dark magenta than a purple here, but we definitely see purple in its darker areas. Now there's no feather, there's no spread, there is very nice shading as it happens. Look at weather on the second line, beginning on the first line, two on the first line. It shades very well and really does add some accents to what you're writing, giving it some personality. Looking at the wet fine nib, we get a much darker tone than we did with the soft fine, really pushing into being a purple very well. Looks great. No feather, no spread. Yes, it shades. It starts much darker. The pen sat for a day before it was used, but as it leveled out, you start to see really a nice darker mid-tone. So it's not dark, but it's not a mid-tone of a purple. And it does still give it some shade. Look at forks on the third line, and glasses. Plenty of shading going on here. Looking at the medium nib, the tone is very much, it's similar, just a tad bit lighter than the majority of the writing that we got with the wet fine nib. It's no feather, no spread. It's not shading as well as it did with the wet fine, but it is still shading. You see it on getting in the second line. Very has a much darker Y than the rest of the word. Hat starts darker, gets lighter, gets dark at the T again. So the shading is doing very well with this paper. Looking at the broad nib, it's a bit darker than we had with the medium nib. It really does own the purple as a mid-tone here. It doesn't feather, it doesn't spread, it doesn't really shade though, so we have a loss of that for what is really a very interesting and unique purple tone. Looking at the back of the page, you see that we get no bleeding, we have no ghosting, no problems. Like most inks, this one comes in a bottle. This is how the Pilot Custom 823 fits. And here is the Pelican M1000. Here is the ink level when you can no longer fill a Lamy Safari. There is approximately 11 milliliters of ink left. The next writing sample is done in a Portage reporter's notebook. Looking at the soft fine nib, it is a tad bit, just a tad bit lighter than we had on the Clairfontaine. It's not feathering or spreading or shading. It's just there. It still is that, is it purple or is it magenta kind of a tone. It's in that really unique space for a color. Looking at the wet fine nib, its tone is quite a bit darker than we had with the soft fine, a tad bit lighter than the darker tones than we got on the Clairfontaine as its overall color. Now, it's not feathering or spreading, it's not shading. While I say it's not shading, I am going to say the last couple words on the fourth line did get a little bit lighter, seeing trays and last words tad bit lighter, so I guess it could shade. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as it was on the Clairfontaine. Quite a bit lighter than it was with the wet fine. It's not feathering, it's not spreading, it's not shading. It is really a great purple tone here, just a little bit off for me. I want a little bit more of it. Looking at the broad nib, it is darker than we had with the medium. It is just a little bit lighter than we had on the Clairfontaine. I wish it was just a tad bit darker. Now, there are a couple of moments of feather that occur. On the second line, at the end of the E, the word the, you see it. And it's on both of the words the, but that is the edge of the paper. However, in the middle of the paper, on this third line, with the T and the H have tiny feathers. No spread, no shading. Looking at the back of the page, you see that we get almost no ghosting. We had nothing bleed through and touch the page underneath. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting it into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook. Looking at the soft, fine nib, the most noticeable thing because of the tone of the paper is it becomes much more of a magenta lean with a little bit of kind of red showing through. Even though this is a purple ink, it's not looking it on this paper. It's not feathering or spreading. It is shading just as well as it did on the Clairfontaine, truly doing a great job when it comes to a non-fountain pen friendly paper. Looking at the wet fine nib, while it is darker than we had with the soft fine, it is quite a bit lighter than we got on the Clairfontaine. And the tone is like a dark magenta with a slight purple lean. It's not feathering, it's not spreading, it is shading. Look at the word "and" on the top line and you see it goes darker to a mid-tone to dark. First on the second line goes dark to lighter to dark. Shades very well on this paper. Looking at the medium nib, it is just a tad bit darker than we had with the soft fine. It is, I want to say, the same tone as far as darkness goes compared to the Clairfontaine, though an entirely different color. Still, like the soft fine, much more of a magenta with a little red lean. The paper has definitely affected the tone of the ink that it's putting down. It is not feathering or spreading. It is shading nowhere near as nice as it did on the Clairfontaine. but it is giving some spots of shading. Looking at the broad nib, we get the same tone that we had with the medium on this paper, just wider lines naturally. A little bit lighter than it was on the Clairefontaine, not a surprise there. We're not getting any feathering, we're not getting any spread. It makes me very disappointed in how the Rhodia did on this particular ink. Now, we're not getting any shading. As we get to the bottom, you're going to see the T of top in the fourth line has a weird moment. That's really me. That was not the ink or the paper. Looking at the back of the page, you see that we have no bleeding, no ghosting. We can easily write on the back.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is just a tad bit lighter than we had on the Clairefontaine. It does not feather, it does not spread. It does shade, though not as well as it did on the Clairefontaine. Only a few spots, and certainly nowhere near as standout as it did on the Clairefontaine. Still great performance, but I think that's why I prefer Clairefontaine over Rhodia. Same company, slightly different paper. Looking at the wet fine nib, quite a bit darker than it was with the soft fine, just a little bit lighter than we had on the Clairefontaine. A little bit more muted as a tone, which I was not expecting with this because the paper is coated so it can sit on top. But it just doesn't have some of the pop that was actually there with the Clairefontaine. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread, it does shade some. You can see it really stand out in certain areas. More so, you see much darker words than some others. Looking at the medium nib, it is lighter than we had with the wet fine. It is just a little bit lighter than what we got on the Clairefontaine. I say a little bit lighter. It's actually quite a bit lighter. It's not feathering. It's not spreading. We can see, if you look at where some of the lines of this quad rule is, it is breaking the ink up some. Just something to keep in mind if you use quad rule paper. No feather, no spread. There is a little bit more shading than we had with the wet fine nib, but not as much shading as we had on the Clairefontaine. Looking at the broad nib, it is a little bit lighter, maybe, than the medium. Certainly quite a bit lighter than it was on the Clairefontaine. I see feathering very unusually on Bilbo on the first line. Look at the IL, and there's a little bit of feathering going on there, which I'm very surprised to see. I also see some feathering on the M of Mead right next to that. Look at the directly underneath that on the H. Tiny bits of feathering. No spread, no shading. Really kind of disappointed with how this sheet of paper did, or maybe it's the ink on this paper. Looking at the back of the page, we had no bleeding, no ghosting, no problem writing back here.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Califolio Lilas. Here is Graf von Faber-Castell Violet Blue. Here is Noodler's Lorraine Mauve. Here is Cairo Euro Soft Snow of O'Hara. The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is a little bit darker than we had on the Clairfontaine. Not the normal thing on this paper. Usually this paper gets a little bit lighter tone. Not feathering, not spreading. It is shading, I want to say, just as well as it did on the Clairfontaine, truly making me very happy with how this is performing. The color is very close. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is darker than we had with the soft fine, quite a bit lighter than we had on the Clairfontaine. More what we're used to with this paper. Now, it's not feathering, it's not spreading, it is shading. You see it in dwarves, in started, in sing, in glass, chip. It shades very well, and it's going to make those student notes look very nice, very easy to then say, I want to go back and look at my notes because look at how fantastic they are. Looking at the medium nib, it is right about the same tone that we had with the wet fine nib, quite a bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It is not feathering, it is not spreading, it is shading, it is looking very good. It is a great choice of an ink for this paper. If you use these notebooks a whole bunch and you can get a hold of some, I think this is a really good ink to use. The color we're getting is very nice. Looking at the broad nib, it is a little bit darker than we had with the medium. Tiny bit lighter than we had on the Clairfontaine. Now, it is feathering a tiny bit. You see it in the L of splash. And that's pretty much it. But the very first word did have some feather in it, drawing some of my attention. No spread. Little bit of shading. You look at it, dump the crocs. You see dump starts a mid-tone, gets lighter, gets much darker. The starts lighter, gets darker. Crocs starts lighter, gets darker, gets light again at the S. Shading very nicely. Looking at the back of the page, you see that we get no bleeding, no ghosting. What a great ink for a student to use.
While it's nice to see inks in the same color family, I prefer to find an ink that complements this color on the page. Here is a green ink by Delta Green. Here is a gray ink by J.R.R. Gris Nuage. Here is a pink ink by Diamine Pink. Here is a yellow ink by Diamine Golden Sands. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is quite a bit darker than we had on the Clairfontaine. I'd say quite a bit because it is just a little lighter than I think we had on the medium nib on the Clairfontaine. Now, it's not feathering, it's not spreading. It is giving, I'm sorry, I'm going to back that all up. I don't know what I was thinking. It is feathering a tiny bit. Look at whole, sand, then, yeah, it's feathering. The feathering, it's be very open to how things go with copy paper. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is just a bit darker than we had with the soft fine. A bit is being generous. It's quite a few tones darker. A lot lighter than we had on the Clairfontaine. It does feather a little bit. It does spread a little bit. Both of those, I think, are very under control. It does give a couple of moments of shading, which make me worry that it might bleed, and I'm hoping not. Looking at the medium nib, it is right about the same tone that we had with the wet fine. It is a bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does feather a little bit, not surprising. It does spread a little bit, not surprising. It does not shade, which is a good thing when we think about this paper. Looking at the broad nib, it is right about the same tone that we had with the medium nib, a little bit lighter than we got on the Clairfontaine. It does feather, it does spread, it does not look like I'm writing with a marker except with a couple of words. Like the word see looks that way, but on the second line, then they went. No, it just looks like it's not behaving perfectly on this horrible, horrible paper. So there is that feather spread. There is no shading. It is copy paper. Looking at the back of the page, you see there's quite a bit of ghosting going on. The ink is getting deep into the paper, but nothing came through and touched the page underneath.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink? The paper I'm using here is yellow Rhodia paper.
This is decent, just decent from a dry fine. Though the drier pens can help bring out the shading, but the darker versions from wetter pens is just fantastic as a darker but not super dark, almost black kind of purple, but just a nice dark purple from a very wet pen. You could use a medium flow broad and get a darker gray tone that has great shading. I've said great a lot here. With that, three distinctively different choices. I go with the medium flow broad for the tone and the shading that I can get.
I hope you got something out of this video, and I want to remind you that the best way you can support this or any channel is to let retailers know where you've heard of something if you were to go to buy.